The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. First released in 1983, this book went on to win the Locus Award for the Best Fantasy Novel of the Year. It did so well that it was later expanded into a series which consists of 7 books total. This book takes the story of King Arthur, but changes it up and tells the story from the perspective of the women. So instead of focusing on King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, it's about the women around King Arthur, centering mainly on his sister Morgane, but also tells the story of Arthur's wife, Guinevere, his mother, Igraine, and his 2 aunts, Vivian and Morgause. It is definitely a unique take on Arthurian legend, and there are a lot of aspects of this book that I really liked, but there were also some aspects of this book that I really didn't like. I'll separate this video into 3 parts. First, I'll give an overview of the story. I'll keep it overall pretty broad though, so there will only be like minor spoilers. Still, if you want to go in blind, probably avoid this section. Then I'll give my review from an entirely non-spoiler perspective, and then finally I'll discuss things that I liked and disliked from a spoiler perspective. The Mists of Avalon is separated into 4 large parts, with each part focusing on a certain event and a set of characters or a single character. This book follows the life of Morgane, a priestess of Avalon, fighting to save her Celtic religion in Britain, where Christianity is threatening to destroy the pagan way of life. The book starts off with Morgane as a young girl before Arthur is even born. Igraine, Morgane's mother, is married, but after her husband dies, Igraine marries Uther Pendragon, the High King, and they have a son together, Arthur, making him Morgane's half-brother. Arthur is heir to the throne, and when he is a young child, an attempt is made on his life. Vivian, his aunt, who is also High Priestess of Avalon and the Lady of the Lake, advises that Arthur should be fostered far away for his own protection. Uther Pendragon agrees with this, and Vivian also takes Morgane to be fostered in Avalon, where she will be trained to become a priestess. During this period, Morgane learns of the rising tensions between the old pagan and the new Christian religions. After years of training, Morgane is finally initiated as a priestess of the Mother Goddess, and Vivian begins grooming her as the next Lady of Avalon, the Lady of the Lake. Arthur claims the throne of Britain after his father, Uther Pendragon, dies in a battle against Saxon invaders. Since Arthur must now defend Britain against the Saxons, Vivian has Morgane make him an enchanted scabbard that will prevent him from dying in battle, and gives him the sacred sword Excalibur. With the combined force of Avalon and Caerleon, where Arthur sits as High King, Arthur repels the invaders. Years later, Morgane leaves Avalon for the court of her aunt Morgause, the Queen of Lothian. While there, Morgane bears a son, Gwydion. Morgane allows her aunt to raise her son, then Morgane leaves Lothian and goes to Arthur's court as a lady-in-waiting to Arthur's wife, the High Queen, Guinevere. Arthur and Guinevere fail to produce an heir, and Guinevere is convinced God is punishing her for her sins. Her largest sin, she believes, is her failure to persuade Arthur to outlaw pagan religion and practice in Britain. On the eve of a decisive battle against the Saxons, Guinevere convinces Arthur to put aside his father's Pendragon banner and replace it with her own Christian banner. This causes relations with Avalon to grow strained. After the battle, Arthur moves his court to Camelot, which is more easily defended than Caerleon. Guinevere and Arthur arrange for Morgane to marry into Wales, far away from Camelot. But because of a misunderstanding, Morgane, who had thought she would be marrying the king's youngest son, Accolon, a druid priest and also a warrior, she actually finds herself betrothed to the King Uriens of Wales, who's old enough to be her grandfather. Morgane marries Uriens and moves to Wales, but in time begins an affair with Accolon. The old people of the hills, who keep the old pagan ways, regard Accolon and Morgane as their king and queen. Morgane tells Accolon that they must bring the kingdom back under the sway of Avalon. This fails, though, and Christianity continues to expand throughout Britain. Morgane, distraught by her failure, then leaves Wales forever. Morgane returns to Camelot under the guise of another sister of Avalon during a Pentecost festival. And wielding great magic, Morgaine and her sister manifest the Holy Grail, one of the sacred items of Avalon, and the assembled court sees the manifestation of the Grail as a holy revelation. When the Knights of the Round Table leave to search for the Holy Grail, an attempt is made to usurp the throne. The book then ends with a climactic battle as the armies of Arthur and the usurper fight for control of the throne. The writing of this book is fairly simple and formal in its style. I definitely wouldn't say that it has a beautiful writing style, but it suits the story well as an Arthurian epic. Also, it is a pretty easy read, and at no point was I confused or had to think about what was going on in the story or with the characters. The most difficult part of this book is just how dense it can be at points, but if you've read other fantasy epics, this book should really be a breeze. Setting and scene descriptions are usually kept pretty bare. This allows the reader to imagine the scene in their own mind, but this is worth keeping in mind if you usually like your authors to paint you a picture. This book definitely doesn't do that. So this book covers a lot of time in history, from the time when Morgana is a young girl until she is an elderly woman. The pacing, I thought, was pretty great throughout most of it, but definitely not perfect. At no point did I think the story was skipping ahead in time too fast, but there were a couple of sections where I thought the book was spending too much time covering certain events and was overstaying its welcome. For example, a large part of this book actually focuses on Guinevere, and that part is definitely more of a slog to get through. And that was mainly due to the fact that she's just a terrible character. Without getting into any spoilers, let's just say she's incredibly annoying throughout pretty much the whole book. But I'll get into more specifics on why I feel that way in the spoiler section. Talking about characters, though, most are well written and interesting. Morgane especially is a fascinating character, and seeing how she changes from early on compared to where she is at the end is truly amazing. The other lead female characters, Morgause, Igraine, Vivian, are all fairly interesting too, and although the book doesn't focus on any of the male characters like Arthur, Lancelot, and the Merlin, they are still represented in the story. You just don't really get to see or hear from them as often as the female characters. The book often glazes over what the male characters are experiencing in the story, unless, of course, the male character is experiencing something with one of the female characters. That's kind of the only time you really get to read about them. Just don't go into this book expecting details on any of the battles or anything like that. That being said, you do get quite a few details on Arthur and Lancelot at the least. Arthur is often portrayed as this caring king who does no wrong and is this shining example of what a king, husband, and man should be. And Lancelot is portrayed as this valiant knight who is the best sword fighter in all the lands. Also, apparently he's very attractive. Like, very, very attractive. All the women want a piece of Lancelot in this book, which, again, does get tiring after reading about it for like the 100th time. Social conflicts were the real highlight of this book, though. You get to experience a lot of different characters with opposing motives, and seeing how these characters interact with each other and come into conflict with each other is often what is truly great about this book. The difference between good and evil is not always clear, and you will likely empathize with a lot of different characters and what they are trying to accomplish. Considering the time period for when this story takes place, women essentially had two main roles they filled for their husbands. One was bearing children, and then two was taking care of the household, which includes raising the children. So you might go into this book thinking that it's just going to be about those two things, and for the most part that is incorrect. There is a lot more to this book than bearing children and taking care of the household. However, most of the first half of this book really does focus on the women's role of bearing children for their husbands. Sex in particular is a very big part of this book. It's not written in a terribly vulgar or erotic fashion, but it is still very much present in the story, so present that it starts to get repetitive and honestly pretty boring. So while yes, I can understand that bearing children and taking care of the household are big parts of some of these characters' lives during this time period, it does get exhausting reading about this time over time over time for literally hundreds of pages. I will say, if you can get through the first half of this book, the second half is far more interesting and covers more of the social conflicts and political intrigue than the first half. I would be lying, though, if I didn't say that I was close to putting this book down in the first half. I am glad I kept at it, though, and made it through to the end, because the second half of this book is far more interesting. A large aspect of this book is about religion, specifically Christianity and how it is slowly taking over Britain. I was reading online about how some people thought that this book was written just as an excuse to bash Christianity. I honestly didn't get that from this book. While Christianity does play a big role in the story, it does not come across as hugely negative in my opinion. It is more or less the history of how Christianity comes in as a new religion in Britain and slowly establishes itself as the dominant religion of the country. Of course, this also means that old religions and ideals are lost in the transition, and it does talk about some of the negatives of this, but I think this is because of Morgaine being the main character who practices the pagan way of life. She's of course going to have a negative viewpoint of Christianity. So it makes sense from that aspect that this book would have more of the negatives, not the positives, on Christianity. Still, though, I didn't get the impression that this book was written just as a reason to bash Christianity. Another thing worth mentioning that I've seen a lot of discourse online about is just because the story is centered around the women, does that mean the men are treated poorly in it, or that men are written to be stupid while the women are superior at everything? And no, that's definitely not the case at all. The male characters are written just as well as the female characters, the only difference being that the women play a more important role in the telling of the story. While I did say I like most of the characters, not all of them are written that well in my opinion. And as I mentioned early, Gwynnifer is a character that I really did not like at all, and the reasons I did not like her was essentially threefold. So number one, she's married to Arthur and wants to provide him with a child that will be heir to the throne. However, she is barren and she does not want to admit it. For years, she keeps lying to herself that she will be able to provide Arthur the heir to the throne, and it is not until she is old and past childbearing years when she finally admits to herself that she was barren all along. And I can understand the pain that this suffering must cause her, since her primary role as the queen is to provide the king with an heir. But even more than that, not being able to bear a child for anyone, woman or man, would be pretty traumatic. And it makes sense that she would be in denial, but as the reader, it is really tiresome reading about this constantly, about how maybe this time she will get pregnant and bring it to term. And that probably wouldn't be a problem if this book didn't harp on this constantly. The second reason I didn't like this character is because she's in love with Lancelot. And this really wouldn't be a problem again if the book didn't remind you constantly about how she wants to have sex with him, but she can't because she's married. And this just keeps coming up time and time again until finally Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere have a threesome. She then has sex with Lancelot again multiple times throughout the story. And if she was thinking that she wasn't barren, and that maybe the problem was with Arthur for why she couldn't get pregnant, then shouldn't she have gotten pregnant from Lancelot? You would think that would make sense, but apparently not for her. And thirdly, at a point in the story, Guinevere is captured and held against her will by her brother, and during this time period, her brother ends up raping her, which is of course terrible. Well, Lancelot shows up and saves Guinevere, and then they have sex. I'm sorry, but if you were just forced against your will by your brother, or anyone for that matter, there is no way you're going to want to have sex right away like that. Even if the person that saved you is your one true love. I just thought that was disgusting. And then she justifies having sex with Lancelot because he saved her? What kind of nonsense is that? So yeah, I really hated her character, and whenever the book started focusing on her, I would really start to check out. And unfortunately, a big chunk of this book, like 25% of it, is all about Guinevere. I would have preferred if this section was left out entirely, or if it was at least cut down substantially. Another character flaw in this book has to do with Vivian. When Morgaine is in Avalon, Vivian essentially tricks Morgaine and Arthur into having sex and having a baby together. Since they had not seen each other for many years at this point in the story, they did not recognize each other until the next morning when they wake up in each other's arms. Then, Vivian is surprised when Morgaine leaves and refuses to return to Avalon, and I'm just like, you tricked Morgaine into having sex with her brother, and Morgaine got pregnant from it. Oh, and then she almost dies giving birth to Gwydion. And now you're surprised that she's not going back to Avalon to become the next Lady of the Lake after you? Maybe you should have thought through that a little bit better. I thought that was really stupid. As you might be noticing by now, and I know I already touched on this a little bit in the non-spoiler section, but a lot of this book has to do with sex or sexual tension between characters. And trust me, I haven't even scratched the surface when it comes to all the sex you read about. The first half of this book focuses so much on characters lusting over each other or characters having sex, it starts to get absurd. And it's not like I'm against reading about sex in books or anything like that, but when it's constantly brought up like this, it just becomes way too much. Another thing about this book is that it's pretty predictable, and maybe this isn't so much a fault with the book itself, because going into this, even though I've never read an Arthurian book before, I already knew a fair share of the story, and likely anyone that reads this book will know those details too, or will at least know the big things about Arthurian legend. So, for example, when the book announced that Gwydion was named Mordred by the Saxons, I was like, oh, okay, he's gonna kill Arthur. And that takes away some of the suspense from the book. And this is not necessarily a fault with the book, I know that, but even if you know nothing about King Arthur or these types of stories, the big things that happen in this story you can see coming from a mile away. You know that Christianity is going to take over, and you know that Avalon is going to disappear into the mist. There was really only a single aspect that surprised me, and that was when Morgaine tried to have Arthur killed. I did not expect this, but that was probably the only thing I didn't see coming. I thought the ending of this book was great, especially how it's tied back to the beginning. So at the beginning of the book, Morgaine, who's a young girl, is holding baby Arthur and cares for him as if she were his mother. Then, at the end of the book, Arthur dies being held by Morgaine, just like how she used to hold him when she was a child and he was a baby. And it is the contrast between these two scenes that are worlds apart, but also so similar, that really drives home how much has changed for these characters and this world, and yet how little has changed at the same time. I thought that was very well done by the author. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I am very conflicted on my opinions of this book. I really like some aspects of this book, but then I really dislike other aspects as well. After finishing this book, I was honestly tempted to try reading the other books in the series, but now that I've had some time to sit and think about it and consider my opinion as a whole, I'm definitely not going to be doing that. Unfortunately, the negatives I had with this book really brought down my enjoyment as a whole. I probably wouldn't recommend this to other readers unless you are a big fan of Arthurian Legend. If you are a fan of these stories, then I think you would like it since it is an interesting take on an already established story, and you get to learn far more about the female characters than you do in other Arthurian legends. But if you're not big into King Arthur and the stories around him, I wouldn't recommend you read this book. Considering all of this, I am glad I made it through to the end, and now that I've read this book, I'm thinking I would like to check out maybe other, more traditional Arthurian books. So if you have any recommendations for me, please let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.